One of her key areas of research, which is the relationship between personal lives and work lives of professionals. She did it in an international context, which is extremely interesting. She's talking today more with respect to her other line of interest, which is philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, and social entrepreneurship. She has a great range of interests, and she's very well trained in sociology and knows a lot of things that a lot of other members of the faculty don't know, so she would be particularly welcome addition to the Humphrey School faculty. She's talking today on a subject that could scarcely be more important, which is how international NGOs are funded. It has a rather grand title, fair enough. It's called A Thousand Wildflowers or a Formal Garden, International Grantmaking and the Structuring of Transnational Civil Society. Carrie, welcome.
Non-governmental organizations that are operating overseas. This matters because to the extent that organizations that are actually based in the locations where they're working are able to garner and receive funding has a huge influence on the way in which work is interpreted and enacted overseas. And so this matters in terms of status bridging for transnational civil society. So there's two main research questions here. First, I'm going to look into what the overall attachment patterns are between US-based foundations and then NGOs that are located outside the OECD, and so what those patterns of attachment look like, who it is that, that foundations are choosing to fund when they choose to fund organizations based outside the OECD. And then more specifically to kind of drill down and to think about to what extent or what can help us predict which foundations are the ones that are kind of enabling 1,000 flowers to bloom, that are going out there and looking for an organization that hasn't actually been previously sponsored by another US-based foundation, right? So you can imagine it would be pretty easy if you're interested in doing grant making in a new region to call up some of your friends at other foundations and say, so we're moving into doing some grant making in Haiti. Who have you funded in Haiti before, and how can we sort of further that work there? Which is different than thinking, I'd like to be supporting some work in Haiti, and then going over to Haiti and trying to determine if there's organizations that haven't previously received funding before but would be worthy of receiving funding. Okay. So the framework that I use to look at this is a framework on partner selection, which is a literature that comes from sociology and organization studies. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I'm using that framework, but in essence, there's very little work that's actually been done on grant-making decisions, especially at the field level. So there's been some work done, the Grantberg et al. Work really looked at how there's personal networks with grantees. So basically, if program officers in a foundation are on the board of different organizations or somehow have personal connections with different nonprofits, that would lead to a higher likelihood of those nonprofits receiving funding, right? So that's a dyad level relationship where you're looking at characteristics of people in the foundations and characteristics of people in the nonprofits and the likelihood that would lead to being funded. There's also been a little bit of work done by Joe Galashkowitz when he was actually here at the University of Minnesota that looks at corporate foundation grant making in the Twin Cities. And what he looked at was to look at the peer networks and how foundations are influenced in their grant making by peer foundations decisions, right? So he looks at a variety of different measures for this, but he's thinking about it more at the field level. So not characteristics between one NGO and one foundation, but rather taken as a whole, looking across a number of different foundations, what sorts of patterns there are in terms of their grant decisions. But there has been very, very little and no actual sort of empirical work done outside of the Foundation Center to analyze what's happening on a field level with respect to international grant making. And my sort of caveat note here is that there's a great conceptual literature on partner selection which I draw from to think about how they're making decisions about who to select. With that said, sort of the terminology around a partner in terms of thinking about grant making is extremely problematic due to the power imbalance in the relationship, obviously. It's generally the foundation that gets to decide who it is that they're choosing to partner with. And the NGO almost never actually has the power to deny that sort of reach out. So I acknowledge all of that, and yet I still am going to talk about partner selection because that's the broader literature, conceptual literature that exists with it. So when we think about partner selection, if we imagine that the foundation is over here on the left and their prospective grantee is on the right, the process of learning, of sort of deciding to fund a particular organization first involves having to learn about its existence and then assessing its quality. Okay? And the existing literature tells us that this is highly facilitated by two main things. One is propinquity, which means how close are they. It's much easier to learn about the existence and quality of an organization that's down the street from you than it is something that's thousands and thousands of miles away. Homophily is how similar the organization is to you. You're much more likely to choose to partner with an organization that that operates similarly to the way that you operate, right? So there's a lot of literature that shows that foundations are sort of structured in a particular way. They're professionalized. They have paperwork requirements, application requirements, reporting requirements that are much easier and much more part of the norms for a lot of US-based organizations, because that's the way they operate with a lot of these bureaucratic procedures. And that's different than the way that a lot of NGOs that operate in the developing world, in the global south, that's different than the way that a lot of them operate, right? So they're not as similar. A third way that you can learn about the existence and assess the quality of a prospective organization is through a third party. So if you don't have propinquity, if you're not close to the organization, and if you don't have homophily, if you're not similar to the organization, which basically characterizes international grant making, right? You're not close to them and you're not similar to them. A lot of times, organizations rely upon third-party information. So what I'm trying to assess here is to what extent are organizations relying on third-party information from other foundations to influence how they're selecting NGOs to fund. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of an example here. I break down 3 different options in terms of how a foundation could choose who to give a grant to. Okay? So if we imagine that that's the Gates Foundation, and they want to do some work on children's health on the continent of Africa, right? This is sort of what they want to do. Now they have to decide who it is that they're going to choose to do this with. The first option is that they have this organization that they've been supporting for 12 years in South Africa that does work on economic development, right? That organization also has a program in children's health, and so then they give them another grant to do a different program, but basically they're just renewing their relationship with an existing organization. So Jim March did some work on organizational learning back in the early 90s, and he characterizes this as exploitation. In essence, they're leveraging their existing knowledge, reducing their uncertainty, and still getting their job done, right? They're repeating, they're continuing their relationship with an existing organization that they already have a relationship with. So they're exploiting that knowledge that they already have. The second option is that they could take a trip to some part of Africa, and they could travel around, and they could ascertain what organizations are in existence there, and then they could somehow try to come up with a way to figure out what was going on with those organizations and assess the quality. But this increases the uncertainty significantly. And this Jim March termed as exploration. So he has this framework where he sort of bifurcates. Exploitation is relying on your existing knowledge, and exploration sort of increases new knowledge, but it also has a lot more uncertainty, right? And so there's been a lot of work that's been done that sort of looks at these two in tension with each other. What I'd like to suggest here is that there's a third option, right? That Gates could call up Rockefeller and say, so, we're interested in doing children's health. You've done a lot of work in children's health in Africa. Who have you funded? And then Rockefeller will send over their grant sheet, and they'll have a conversation. And then Gates will make a grant to the organization that Rockefeller's been funding for the last 10 years. So they're able to create a new relationship for Gates, but it's a relationship with an organization that's already receiving funding from another US-based foundation. And for the sake of this project, I'm calling that contagion, which is the terminology that Joe Glaskowitz used when he did his field level study of corporate foundations here in the Twin Cities. So to what extent foundations are relying upon signals of status, of quality, of the choices of their peer foundations when they're making their choices. Okay, so why do we care about this? So there's been research that shows that sort of proximal distance to knowledge is correlated with novelty, right? So the farther something is away from you, the more likely it is that it will be novel. The more likely it is that you could learn something new from that. And so if we're constantly relying upon our existing relationships, we're limiting what we can learn about a potential sphere. And so the idea is that if we sort of break out of our networks, we have the potential to learn more. So foundations could learn more by reaching out of their networks and exploring a little bit more. And sort of on a field level, this matters because we know that sort of similarly that innovation often comes with entrants rather than incumbents. So the new folks that are coming in are often the ones that can come in with new ideas, whereas the ones that have been existing already often end up, for lots of different reasons, having some similar ideas, okay? So new NGOs might try new things. And then finally, it really matters in terms of sort of global inequality and status because we know that that the NGOs that exist outside of these funding networks have a very hard time breaking in, right? And that process of breaking in can be very, very difficult. And so what ends up happening then often is what we call in sociology the Matthew effect, right? More will go to those who have some and to those who have none. And so what ends up happening is there's a huge bifurcation there, and so that matters if we care about challenging the status quo. Okay. So the sort of main hinge for the hypotheses here is about the role of uncertainty and trying to think about what organizations do when they're faced with uncertainty. Okay, so international grant making involves a great deal of uncertainty. As we've already talked about, they don't have propinquity and they don't have homophily, and they're sort of trying to navigate in a new space. And so with respect to the first research question, what the overall attachment patterns are between US-based foundations and NGOs located outside the OECD, there's going to be hypotheses with respect to what I call market-level uncertainty, so industry-level uncertainty. The sort of task of doing international grant making in and of itself is the market that international grant makers exist within, and so that has a great deal of uncertainty. The second question is specifically when foundations are seeking a new grantee, so they want to partner with somebody new. They don't have maybe in their portfolio an existing NGO that they can fund, so if they want to fund somebody new, to what extent do they call up friends or do they rely upon other funders' past choices, so resulting in contagion, and to what extent do they sort of explore and try someone new? And for this, I use different understandings of firm-level uncertainty. So specifically here, foundation-level uncertainty, and things that the foundations can do to counteract the market-level uncertainty that they have of international grant making. So I'll say a little bit more about that. So with respect to market-level uncertainty, we know that partner selection is characterized by a great deal of uncertainty, especially at the time of the decision. That it's very, very difficult to get perfect information and to know you're making a great decision about your partner, whether this is hiring somebody for a sports team, figuring out who you want to marry, hiring somebody for a job. At the moment of the decision, there's a huge amount of information that you don't have, and so that's highly uncertain. We know this even more in the context of grant making, that especially for nonprofits, it's really difficult to sort of quantify or evaluate the quality of a nonprofit at the time of making the decision. And then again, this is sort of multiplied when they're working internationally. So I hypothesize here that given these conditions of market level uncertainty, foundations will utilize exploitation. So they will renew existing relationships. And if they can't renew existing relationships, then they will copy the grant choices of other foundations, right? They'll rely upon contagion. So the second set of hypotheses is about firm-level uncertainty. So we know that given adequate resources, that organizations can temper this tendency to just copy what's going on, right? That they can get the resources that give them the confidence to sort of operate more in this situation of uncertainty. And so what I wrote up here is that developing sort of this expertise increases an organization's ability to differentiate between real and perceived risk, right? So if you're new in a situation, everything sort of seems uncertain and risky. But the more you develop confidence and facility in a new situation, you have the ability to differentiate between, well, this seems uncertain, but I have enough experience here to be able to differentiate and know sort of what I'm doing, right? So what I hypothesize is that to the extent that organizations can reduce their uncertainty, that to the extent that they can do different things to reduce this uncertainty, then they will feel more confident to explore. And when they can't do that, then they'll be more likely to use contagion to copy other foundations. Grant. Okay, so the data that I used for this are from the Foundation Center. So the Foundation Center collects all of the grants that have been given by all of the US-based foundations from 2000 on. And so I have grant data from 2000 to 2012. I just gained access actually to this range of data. Before I only had 6 years, so I'll tell you when I'm going through the results. The very last result, I actually have only done the analyses on the previous range of data. So for that 13-year period, just roughly, this is about 160,000 grants that are worth about $53 billion. And then in the orange bullet points are the subset that was specifically to non-OECD countries, okay? So that 160,000 grants, the 53 billion, is to support international work, both through organizations based in the US, organizations based in the OECD, and then organizations based in the non-OECD countries, okay? So 1,700, nearly 1,700 foundations were participating in this kind of work, but only 345 of them actually granted to organizations based in the non-OECD, right? So 21% of the foundations wanting to support work internationally are actually doing that directly through funding organizations based in the non-OECD. And then, again, as a whole, there are over 32,000 unique non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, that are doing this work internationally. But of those that receive funding, but of those, only 35% are actually based in the non-OECD world, which is where the work is occurring. Just to give you a sense of the age of the foundations, this distribution actually looks exactly the same for those regardless of where they're supporting, right? So this is specifically to non-OECD NGOs, but it looks the same for the foundations that are supporting NGOs in the OECD. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, kind of conceptually what we're thinking about here, what I wanted to try to think about was developing an associational network of foundations, right? So if each of these nodes is one of the foundations that supports NGOs in non-OECD countries, okay? And the ties between them, the lines between each of those foundations, means that they share a grantee at some point over the period of study, okay? And so sort of the question here is, to what extent can NGOs sort of run around in this connected network? And to what extent are they sort of stuck out here on the outside with foundations that are only being funded by one foundation, okay? So 3 different dependent variables. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here on how these are calculated, but if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about that. But in short, exploitation is the percent of grant-making dollars that go to support an existing relationship. So to the extent that Gates continues to give funding to the same organization, that's exploitation would be a percent of their overall grant-making. Contagion is the percent of the grant-making that goes to an NGO that they sort of learned about from somebody else. And exploration is the percent of their grant-making in dollars that goes to a new organization that's never been funded by another US-based foundation. Okay. And then with respect to the second set of hypotheses about firm-specific uncertainty, these are the different variables that I use to sort of try to capture different things that organizations can do to try to counteract the uncertainty of international grant making. Okay, so the average length of their relationship with a grantee, so to what extent a foundation is developing long-term relationships with NGOs based in the non-OECD, you'd imagine they would be learning more about what work looks like on the ground in some of these countries, and get a better sense of sort of what that looks like, and be able to then, therefore, differentiate more between real and perceived. Their overseas development focus is a % of their total grant making. So if they are doing, if we took their total grant making in a year, and then took the % of that they're sending to non-OECD countries, so you'd imagine that if that's a higher %, that they're focusing more of their effort and their energy and their thought thinking about granting to non-OECD countries, that would feel less risky for them, right? For foundations, they actually have just a binary, whether they express a domestic preference. So if they've expressed, oh, we specifically focus on the United States, you'd imagine they might have less facility thinking about granting internationally. A measure of geographic diversity, so how many different countries they work in. Application system is whether they have an open or a closed application system. So if you're familiar with the world of philanthropy, some foundations you can sort of just submit an application to online for funding, and some of them are closed, which means it's invitation only. So in essence, they go through their own networks and they pick out who they want, and then they invite them to submit an application. And then finally, the assets of the foundation. Okay, so let's look at the findings. So first, this is sort of outside of the formal research questions, but I just wanted to give you a picture first of how grant making to non-OECD countries compares, at least in the data that we have, to grant making to OECD countries. So as we noted in the beginning, 14% of the dollars go to non-OECD countries, and that's about 19% of the grants, right? So there's not a huge difference here between the number of grants and the number of dollars. And then the number of grants is only 19%, but the number of NGOs that they're supporting in the non-OECD is at 35% of the total sample, right? So what this tells us is that it looks like they're sending more grants to fewer organizations in the US and fewer grants to more organizations overseas, right? So they're continuing to use their US-based organizations for multiple purposes.
Is this number of grants or dollars?
That's number of grants, they're fairly correlated. So sending multiple grants to the organizations in the US, and then fewer grants to each of the organizations that they're supporting overseas. Now, I don't have the data to figure out the size of these different organizations, but my sense is that this is probably because a lot of the US-based organizations are much larger and operate multiple programs, and so they're getting multiple grants for very different things. Okay, so the range of grants overall was between 10,000 and almost $1 billion. But in the non-OECD countries, the highest grant was 165 million. So that's not entirely surprising. And then the overall mean for all of the grants to support international work is 350,000. But for organizations in the non-OECD, the mean is lower. It's about $100,000 lower, right? So the mean overall grant is lower, but the median grant to non-OECD countries is higher, right? So what this tells us is that there's probably a few large outliers of huge, huge grants to some very large US-based or other OECD country organizations, but that the average grant, or the sort of the median grant, right, the more grants that you see more often to the non-OECD are actually a little bit higher.
Can you just say what those numbers are on that?
Oh, I'm sorry, can you not see that? So the mean is 350,000, and the mean is 50,000. Sorry, the mean is 350,000, and the median is 50,000 over the whole sample. And then the mean to organizations in the non-OECD is 245,000, and the median is 80,000. Yeah, sorry about that. So that's the distribution. The distribution looks fairly similar because the difference is way up here for the really, really gargantuan grants. But overall, the distribution looks fairly similar. Okay, so the first research question, what does grant making to non-OECD countries look like? So I predicted that market level uncertainty would predict exploitation in partner selection. And so this is what we see, right? So that 62% of the grant dollars that go to support international work go to organizations that the foundation has already funded. Does that make sense? Okay. However, what we also notice here is that when they're thinking about a new partner, right, so the green and the red here are new partners, 25% of the time when they're selecting a new partner, they're selecting an organization that's never been funded by another US-based foundation. And 13% of the time, they select an organization that has been funded, right? So almost twice as often when they're selecting a new partner, they're selecting an organization that has never been funded by another US-based foundation. I can talk about in the limitations some data things that may be causing this that I'm still going to try to investigate. But so far, I think that goes against what we predicted, right? We would have expected to see a lot more contagion because of the uncertainty. So there's a strong amount of exploration happening. So 77% of the foundations in the sample that support NGOs and the non-OECD are actually supporting what I call unique NGOs. NGOs that don't receive funding from any other US-based foundation. Okay? And only 80 or 23% of the foundations are not doing any of that, right? They're never supporting an NGO that hasn't received funding from someone else. So what this results in is actually a large field of sort of NGO wildflowers, right? So 85% of the NGOs only receive funding from one US-based foundation over the 12 years, 13 years under study, okay? So in that whole entire period of time, the vast majority of NGOs here are only receiving funding from one US-based foundation, which goes against a lot of what we predicted. So it isn't this story of an NGO entering into the network and then bouncing around and collecting funding from lots of different foundations. This isn't surprising, but since obviously they are only supported by one foundation, they are receiving a comparatively lower share, obviously, of the total grant dollars over that period of time. Right, so they make up 85% of the population, and they're taking in about 42% of the funding. But again, that's not surprising. So then the second question, when foundations are seeking a new grantee, what influences their use of exploration versus contagion when they're trying to decide who it is that they want to work with? And so we suggest that, and the existing literature suggests that firm level uncertainty will predict contagion, and to the extent that foundations can overcome this firm level uncertainty, can utilize different practices and resources to overcome this firm level uncertainty, then they'll also be much more likely to explore when they're seeking a new partner. So it was sort of a dense text or a regression table, so I went for dense text. But this generally does find support, okay? So there are firm-specific practices that result in predicting decreased uncertainty, we assume at least the decreased uncertainty, which then results in increased exploration and decreased contagion in terms of partner selection. So foundations that focus a larger percentage of their grant making on development NGOs or on NGOs that are in non-OECD countries are more likely to explore, right? They have the confidence from their experience working in this realm. In addition, those that have greater assets are more likely to explore, and this also is not surprising. That it's an extremely costly endeavor to fly overseas and to do the due diligence and the research and the vetting on the ground to actually find and develop relationships with new partners. And so the foundations that have more resources are more likely to do this. Similarly, the longer a foundation's average relationship is with their grantee, the less likely they are to copy others, okay? The more likely they are to explore. So if the foundation has sort of a tendency of having 5, 6, 7-year-long grant relationships with their grantees, you'd imagine they'd learn a lot more about the context of the work than if a foundation that just sort of funds one NGO for 1 year and then bounces along and funds a different NGO for a different year, that they'd be much less likely to be able to learn from that relationship. Okay, so sort of overall what we find is that there's a sort of small formal garden that's well supported by US-based foundations, and that exploitation is associated with more firm-level, firm-specific uncertainty, okay? To the extent that, I apologize, I used old wording here. This should say contagion is associated with more firm-specific uncertainty. Okay, but then also there's this vast field of wildflowers, and that we know that exploration is associated with having greater knowledge and greater resources over time, which gives foundations the confidence to be able to make these decisions, to go out, to gather the information, then to make decisions to fund a new organization. Okay. So I think there's a few different, sort of conceptually, there's a few different things that we're able to see through doing this work. One is that what I'm trying to do is sort of this framework that Jim March advances, the differentiation between exploitation and exploration, basically treats all new relationships as exploration. It doesn't differentiate between them. And so if Gates funded sort of a brand new organization that no one's ever funded before, or if they just called up Rockefeller and copied sort of their entire grant portfolio, that would all get treated as the same, because at the organizational level, it's a new relationship for Gates. But I guess what I want us to try to think about is to think a little bit higher, sort of think more at an institutional level about what it means for a relationship to be new. And I think especially when we're thinking about these things as scholars and practitioners in civil society and the public world, these things are really important, because we don't just care about, sort of for a firm, what matters in terms of their individual advantage, right? What we care about is sort of what we're bringing to the broader public sphere. And to the extent that foundations are sort of breaking out and doing new things that other foundations have not done before, that can arguably advance the public good, at least in different ways, if not quantitatively in a better way. Okay? And then I think, you know, I guess it just pushes also a little bit farther for us to think about how some of the sort of dyad level choices, so individual choices that foundations are making, can either challenge or reinforce some of the broader inequalities that we see, right? So there's a possibility that foundations, or that donors in general, in their grant making, can challenge sort of the existing status quo and the existing sort of structures of inequality in terms of who they fund and who they don't fund, or they can challenge those in different ways and think about sort of more diversity in the organizational landscape that's happening overseas. Okay. So some of the limitations, this is clearly a subset of all of the international development funding, right? So when I talk about exploration or contagion, it's relative to the funding decisions of other US-based foundations. And I know, personally, from my qualitative work in this world, that that is not the only portfolios of grant making that foundations look to, right? That if Gates is going to make a decision, they don't just call up US-based foundations. They also have foundations in Europe that they have relationships with. They look at the decisions of bilaterals and multilaterals, that there's a lot of different funders in this landscape, and we can't evaluate that with this current data set. So we need to do that moving forward, certainly. The other big thing that we're struggling with right now is the role of intermediaries, right? So we know that tax laws for international grant making are complicated, and it places the onus of sort of the due diligence. So if a foundation is making a grant to a domestic 501c3, that 501c3 status is sort of the reassurance that they're giving it to a charitable cause, right? So within tax law, that's the way it works. If a foundation wants to grant to something that exists outside of nonprofit tax law, so outside of the United States, we put the onus on the foundation to do the due diligence to ascertain whether that organization is sort of up to snuff in being a charitable cause. And there's a lot of fuzziness around what that means. It largely seems like, from my qualitative work in this area, that there's actually not a huge bar that foundations need to jump through to demonstrate that, but different foundations have different levels of comfort with how much of that they do. And so some foundations that are more hesitant to directly grant overseas will grant through an intermediary organization, like the Tides Foundation, if you've heard of them, which basically, they just are like a pass-through for the grants, right? So the Freeman Foundation will decide that they want to support 12 different organizations that are working in a particular arena in Guatemala. And then they'll send all that money to Tides, and then Tides will write all those checks to those 12 organizations. So that, like, if something went down, tax-wise, Tides would take the brunt of it, and the Freeman Foundation would be sort of sheltered. So a big piece of what I'm trying to do right now is to try to think about how we tease apart the role of intermediaries within this larger space. So, sort of what's up next? Thinking more about subjective perceptions of uncertainty. So actually, the previous version of this that I did with the smaller data set, I examined not just objective uncertainty, right? So market level uncertainty and firm level uncertainty, but an organization's subjective perceptions of uncertainty, right? And what I found was that that large professional organizations, so the large professionalized independent foundations that we think of when we think of professional foundations, sort of carry with them this logic of expectation that they're going to go out there and explore, that it's their role to go out and bring in new organizations, and they have huge assets so they can do that, right? The professional organizations that have a little bit less assets, right, so they're still sort of held to the same subjective expectations, professional expectations, but they don't have as many resources, are much more likely to copy what the big well-endowed foundations do. And then there's a third group of what I call like specialty foundations that have their own sort of professional and personal expectations and norms around what their behavior should look like, right? So the corporate foundations or the family foundations or the community foundations, and they're not copying what the professional foundations are doing because they operate in their own little institutional sphere. So that's what I found in the previous run of data, but I have to do a lot of coding and figure out how that's going on with our current run of data. There's some qualitative work to be done to better understand sort of who falls within their influence set, right? So right now, analyzing other US-based foundations and how they interact with other US-based foundations, but trying to figure out who else they call up when they're trying to figure out who to grant to. And then to explore the mechanisms of contagion, right? So to think more about how does this happen? Are they calling them up? Are they meeting at meetings? Are they just sort of downloading their 990 and looking at who they've granted to? Sort of how does this process of contagion work? And then again, as I mentioned, we have to drill down a little bit more about sort of the role and the range of intermediaries and how they play into this. So that's where we're at. So I would love to hear your reactions or your thoughts or your questions.
Okay, so I'm going to be super boring and ask you questions about methodology. And in particular...
Can you just say your name and where you're from?
Absolutely. Jonathan Borowski. I'm a PhD student in the economics department.
Okay.
And my question is, when you do your analysis, do you dollar weight, or is each grant one observation? And so the reason why I bring this up is that there's this sort of in regression analysis of businesses, at least, there's a sort of understood problem that if you just do a straight regression without reweighting it, you're getting almost all of your results from very small businesses. And from a public policy perspective, almost all of the money is in sort of a smaller number of large businesses. So sort of two things are happening. First, you're getting, if there are differences between the small organizations and the big organizations, you're mostly looking at this, right? Like, so that $145 million grant, that's one. whereas it seems like that's actually quite a large percentage of what's in the data. So skewing the results by looking mostly at smaller organizations is sort of one thing that comes out of that, but it also means that you're going to overstate statistical significance if you're looking at that. So I guess if you hadn't, I think it would be really interesting to just run and present everything exactly the same, dollar weighting by the size of the grant maybe, and see if the results were the same, because if they're different, I don't know, a lot of what you said is really interesting,
Yeah.
but that's the first question I'm asking is, are these really results which are almost exclusively about atypical small grants?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with the terminology you're using, but I have done, I ran all of the models, both with grant counts and with grant dollars. And then also, when I was doing the ones with grant dollars, did a bunch of different permutations where natural logs of them, and also took out the large outliers, because I think it is true.
Yeah. So maybe I can just write you an
That'd be
email
great.
offline about this, because it sounds like what you're talking about is you're using your sort of dependent variable as dollars. Whereas I'm more thinking about, you can, in a regression, you can reweight things. And so if you do cross-country studies, it's sort of common to reweight by the population of the country, so that a big country counts for more than a little country in determining the results, and also measuring how much variation there actually is. I'm happy to
I'd love to
take
see
that
your email.
offline so that we can discuss more interesting things.
Brian?
Well, I didn't understand much of that last conversation. Thank you, Carrie. This is really interesting and has great potential. All I want to say is that it's really taking a picture of a fast-moving train here, because, as you know, there's a lot of pressure on foundations and donors to go with local ownership. So the real challenge nowadays is trying to figure that out. And there are a few foundations, including the Open Society Foundation, who put people on the ground in very key places, for example, in the office in Amman, Jordan. And so they're watching. They don't need exploration, or the other phrase that you used, contagion. They can do it themselves and see what's working and what isn't. The other, I wanted to know where you thought this particular model would fit. There are organizations, including one in this town, the Center for Victims of Short Truth Problems we're familiar with. They're doing a lot of training, and they're beginning to spin off their local partners. They're basically training them. They reduce the risk by doing their own training and giving them accounting systems and all of the rest, and then urging them to register locally. And they're independent to that extent. They may still have a relationship after, and there may still be money going from OSF, for example, to CBT, then to the local organization. I'm not sure whether that's contagion. If it is, it's a different form, it seems to me. I did the same thing at NDI. We trained organizations, and then we spun them out and urged them to become local, basically, and licensed locally. Where does that fit in your categories?
So with respect to the first question about open society, and this is the coding that we haven't drilled down into yet, but we have coding for operating foundations, which is what open society is, right? So a foundation that sort of designs and operates its own program, so it gives rather than giving external grants, it gives most of its resources to programs that they run. And so I think that certainly it's sort of a different case because of the structure of the way in which it works. With regard to your second question, are you talking about U.S.-based organizations that are initiated in the U.S. that then get spun off to register locally? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm talking about U.S. organizations that go over to Africa, Jordan, or wherever, train local organizations that may not even exist as an organization initially, but then they basically train them to become an organization, an institution that functions within the local context.
Right. And so you're saying that technically that would look like a grant to a U.S.-based organization, but it would be supporting work what's happening overseas.
Well, they would encourage the local organization to then go out and seek funding
Right.
from other organizations.
Yeah, and so I think that falls into this complicated, very important, murky category of intermediaries right now, and how we're going to tease that apart. I think it's going to be one of the crucial things to try to understand what we're doing.
I think that's it's growing.
Yeah.
I think it's
No, it's huge.
Thanks, Carrie. It was really interesting and important research. There's not enough research, as we know, that's done on funders, so I think it's a really important piece. I want to go to the other end of the spectrum, which is really the question of wildflowers and formalized gardens, and wondering whether either of those, whether you have values judgment as to, in terms of public policy, which is better.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I have to admit, I think when I first embarked on this project, I sort of did. But I think the realization is that if there's limited funding, there's a trade-off to either approach, right? So that if we just support a few NGOs and everybody calls up their friend and gives them a grant, the challenge is that new NGOs can't break into that. The advantage is that those NGOs are fairly healthy, right? That they're getting lots of fertilizer and water, and like they're thriving and can do the things that we know that a lot of resource-starved nonprofits can't do. And they don't let in sort of new entrants, right? On the other hand, if you are always going out there and funding new NGOs and nobody else picks them up, then often you have a lot of NGOs that are sort of limping along with not enough resources. And so it seems like sort of, from a civil society democracy perspective that you'd want some healthy balance of both, right? That sort of, if the pendulum swung too far in one direction or the other, I would be concerned. But as it is, it seems like it's sort of somewhere in the middle, and that seems to me like a fairly healthy balance. Would we wish that there were more resources so that all of that could sort of get larger and change? Of course, but given, if we assume that the resources are limited, sort of distribution right now seems like it enables a little bit of both, which I think would support a lot of arguments for civil society. So, Bob?
You mentioned this organization ties in a neat bottom. I was curious, can you characterize its value added? Is it legal matters? Is it auditing? What exactly does it do to improve the performance of the system?
So I think there's a huge spectrum of these intermediary organizations, right? Tides, in and of itself, doesn't do that much. They literally just pass through grants. So the Freeman Foundation can say, I want you to write a check to these 12 organizations. The Freeman Foundation sends the check to Tides with like a 5% increase for their overhead, and then Tides passes it along. And it basically just serves as a legal buffer, so that if something went down untoward overseas, the Freeman Foundation wouldn't get that publicity from it, because they're sort of de-identified then at that point, right? From the whole process. And so they just sort of provide that buffering. But there's a huge range of other intermediaries that have different levels of support, right? So like the Global Fund for Women or the Global Fund for Children, which they sort of solicit funds from, which are both based in the United States, one in DC and one in California. They solicit funds from foundations, and then they redistribute those funds to very small organizations overseas, often just for a few years. But they do a wide range of other sort of capacity building. They do site visits to the organizations. So I think there's a huge range of what intermediaries look like in this sphere. And also there's a huge range of how much direction the donor can have in terms of where the money ends up going to, right? So Tides doesn't do much with the organizations, but the donor can pretty much direct who they want the funding to go to. Sort of Global Fund for Children, the organization does more, and the donor is more disconnected, right? So often the donor can't say, please send the money to organization X. That organization itself actually chooses that. Melissa?
I'm really struck by your comment around the healthy balance between A Thousand Wildflowers and a formal garden. But I agree with that, and also I was a little surprised to see. I wasn't expecting that you would find it, right?
No, I didn't either.
But I'm wondering, you were interested in looking at the structure of the sort of NGO world. The extent to which that balance is idiosyncratic is by luck, or does it have something to do with the structure of the foundation world? And even potentially the role, maybe that's where the role of intermediaries begins to begin. You know, what's driving that balance from the foundation side, not the NGO side, from the foundation side?
Yeah.
And is there some sort of structure issue going on there that,
Yeah.
that's not your research, but I'm curious what.
No, I mean, I'm curious about that too, and my sense is that it's, and this is sort of a future analysis challenge and a future coding challenge, is that right now exploration is coded as any organization that didn't previously receive funding from another US-based foundation, right? But what that can look like in practice can be very different for organizations, right? So it could mean that a foundation with a lot of resources is going overseas and doing due diligence and research and then selecting an organization and sending them funds. It could also be that a foundation is like a pass-through funding intermediary, right? So the Women Works, which is based in Texas, sends 100% of the funding they receive to Women Works in Ethiopia, right? That there could be sort of independent relationships between organizations overseas and sort of smaller foundations that just sort of channel money in between them that by their very nature wouldn't be something that would be connected into the network, right? And so that I think probably what's happening is that there's sort of two different worlds happening, which is sort of the professional world, the professional foundation world, and then all these sort of smaller specialty foundations, which drive patterns of exploration, but I think for very different reasons. And so I think it'll be really interesting to drill down into that and try to understand it more.
John Pratt with the Council of Nonprofits. I wonder if you could say a few words about, for the other end of partner selection, because certainly these organizations in each of these countries would love to have a foundation partner and actively seek them out and do whatever they can to make these connections. And is there anything about this, or how they can improve their odds of, raise their visibility, legitimacy, use their other foundation connections? They'd love to be a part of the contagion, probably.
Yeah.
And one last thought is that the high percentage of sort of grantee organizations that just had one foundation relationship really seemed odd to me.
Yeah.
It seems like they're not being very successful at getting multiple partners.
Right. Yeah, I think two things there. I think that the sort of mechanisms through which NGOs can sort of increase their probability of being contagious, I think we'll learn more about when we do more of the qualitative research to actually understand sort of what's flowing through and how it is that foundations are learning about these organizations and making these decisions. I think that'll give us a much better insight into how that process occurs, right? Because I'll be curious to know to what extent those are things that the organizations actually have agency over, right? Or to what extent it's just, it's about the funder relationships with each other. We'd hope that the organizations have a bit of agency as people who care about the health of the nonprofit sector. But we do know, again, that this is a highly imbalanced power relationship, and so I'll be curious to see how much that actually stands. Your second question?
It was about the high proportion of sort of grantees that only had one relationship.
Yeah, no, and I think that was also very surprising to me. There's some data things that I need to do to sort of, I can test more conservatively to see, because what we do to sort of create that measure is hold the first few years of grant making constant, right? So that those aren't counted as either exploration or contagion, with the idea that, Rockefeller could give a grant in 2000 that Gates doesn't pick up until 2006, and so you need to sort of hold a wide buffer there. So I'm playing with some different things to see if that changes that.
I follow up, John, maybe John is the answer to this, but how open are foundation and foundation boards to revealing some of the information you need to get at these issues? I won't put you on the spot.
I mean, so I've done quite a bit of research on foundations and grant making, and it's definitely not easy to gain access to foundations, especially to their decision-making processes, but I've been doing it for 7 or 8 years now, so I'd like to say that I have a little bit more access than I did at least 7 or 8 years ago. And I think certainly the more professionalized the foundation, the higher degree of sort of transparency they have around their procedures. procedures, whether they're formal procedures or actually the procedures they use to make their grants, or another story again, probably. But yeah, it's important.
Carrie, I don't know what sort of detail you have about the grantees. I'm interested in these possibly very small organizations. Do you know staff size, or how long they've been in existence, or?
I would love to know that, and I know none of it.
Okay.
I know where they're located, and I know the purpose of the grant, but I don't know anything about their size.
Do you know their names?
I know their names.
Hi, Carrie. Well, we talked briefly, and I'd like to talk to you more. Until I came to Humphrey School, my work was all in the foundation world, and I just realized that what I did in my career was the exploration part of that, either as part of foundations or consulting foundations. And I have a lot of thoughts that are kind of sparked by what you're talking about. One thing you mentioned a bit, but not enough. One thing that I found in all of my work with foundations, and I work exactly on this in developing country, NGOs, and this kind of relationship, was also this problem of the fit of the foundation's mission and description of itself, the identity of the kind of work it did and the way it did work, and matching that up with NGOs in other countries. And the problem with the contagion issue wasn't that foundations weren't talking to each other, because they talk to each other a lot. And they may talk to each other but decide not to follow one another. There's an awful lot of consultation that goes on. But that they may not match up in terms of what they want to do. And the way that agencies match themselves to overseas foundations is going to be different than they do in the United States. There's a whole different pattern and relationship. So I think that's something that's very important to look at. And that's where Brian's question about how can you get into the decision-making of that board, because those conversations are fascinating about fit.
Yeah.
About, does this fit with us? So, Gates is doing this, but it doesn't quite fit with the direction we want to go. And that's where you get a lot of this episodic, even if they are aware that there's another foundation doing something that's very closely related, but something's not quite right there. The other argument that I would make is...
Can I just ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So you're saying, though, that then that would lead to foundations being more willing or more interested in taking the risk and exploring than using contagion and copying someone's choice just because of the degree of fit was off. That's interesting.
That's the argument I would make. And then the other issue is about those NGOs that Deborah asked you on the other side. I'm fascinated by this because overwhelmingly my perception, country by country by country that I worked in, the relationship is someone in the NGO world in that country who fits well with the foundation. And it's overwhelmingly an American educated person or someone who can talk really well to an American foundation, and somehow they're able to talk the language and fit. I have seen again and again and again foundations make exploration trips to say Vietnam, and then come back and say nobody's doing what we're doing because they couldn't understand the same language, and yet they were doing the same thing or a very similar thing. So there's some kind of issue that goes on with this selection that I found really frustrating in my work.
And I mean, I think that that's very true, right? And that's why sort of the homophily literature exists, right? It's that we choose the people who look like us and who talk like us and who are educated like us. And so that's why I think it's interesting when those things don't align, how the foundations make these choices.
Any question?
I had a question on Hong Kong, but I forget about that. So, I'm in research class right now, and probably class is studying for UNAM. And one of the things similar to what Cheryl was saying, I did research in Africa by non-profit organizations. And what I found was that this organization might kind of local one, but if they don't have a connection with people, contingency to say international, they ran out of business. And these NGOs are actually the purpose they are doing what they do. So I guess, what do you think need to be the way, how do you think like they could work better, like create more connection with the international? Do that?
I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think it relates to his question, and it's certainly what I predicted going in, right? That my sense from working in Tanzania for 7 years with small local NGOs was that it was really difficult to get that first grant, but once they got that first grant, then they kept getting funding, right? But getting that first grant was like, it often required a lot of homophily, right? It required somebody who could make trips to the US, who could sort of relay things, translate them, not from Swahili to English, but sort of into the right terminology for donors. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult process, and so I was actually really surprised to see that there wasn't more of that. I think a totally fascinating study, which I would love somebody to do, is to sort of track on, like, to pick a country or pick a region within a country and track funding attempts, right? And to be able to look at which ones become successful and which ones are not, because we can't really evaluate this until we have that comparative data.
I can't do that for you, maybe you have to
So where does content fall in this? So when I think about funding, usually my head doesn't go into this. I mean, this is new to me, but it goes into content. And often where we see the need, right, and we have the evidence for work being needed in certain areas, that's not where the funding is, because funders have certain ideas of what they want to fund. So organizations on the ground are actually adjusting now to the realities that they see work to the funders' content desires. So where do you fit content into this?
I think it's an excellent question. I think it's certainly something that I think is starting to get a little bit of attention, sort of the idea of funder fads and how those sort of get mapped onto, you know, different issue areas and what happens over time. I think what I was trying to do with this was to just sort of take a different lens on it, and so to look at it through the organizational lens and think about to what extent, you know, we need to understand how content drives decisions, and we also need to understand how relationships and sort of existing relationships or new relationships drive decisions. And I think eventually what would be nice is to be able to layer them on top of each other, right? And to see how they interact. So I agree.
Well, how do you think they'll interact?
Well, I mean, so the thought was, right, that exploitation, sort of the idea of just renewing a relationship with an existing organization, would be used as a really easy way to deal with that, right? So that the funder would become interested in something new. They wouldn't want to have to, my assumption, although Carrie might debate this, was that the funder it would involve a lot of uncertainty to try to find a new partner to partner with to do that work, and so then they'd fund the same partner to do different work. Or, second choice, they would call up somebody who had done work in that realm before, and then they'd fund them to do it. It's the way I've seen it, at least, sort of in the work that I've done with foundations so far. And then the sort of last choice option would be to try to find a new organization that's doing it really well. So that would be my sense of how it would work out.
Well, and sort of a related set of questions is sort of resource dependency strategies. So it's true that the funders have money and these organizations need it, but the local organizations have legitimacy, connection. You know, they are satisfying desires that the funder has, and they have some strategies available to them to influence, you know, sort of that, what is their agency, and for those that are successful, how and why are they successful, and, you know, what are some of the tension points between them. Because I think, you know, looking at both sides of this relationship, it's
Crucial.
It would help, you know, understand what's happening upstream.
Yeah, I think this is there's no research done on international grant making, and so it's hard because you start and you need everything all at once to be able to answer questions comprehensively. But I think, yeah, we're inching in, and if anybody else wants to do a complementary study, please talk to me.
I have just a couple more thoughts. One is that in so many developing countries, there may be one or two people who are, I always thought of them as the fixers. They were the ones that if you surveyed the foundation world, you started saying, if the foundation, for example, said, oh, we want to start working on nursing in Rwanda, everybody said, well, you need to talk to so-and-so. There was like one person who was the person that everyone seemed to talk to. That didn't mean they worked with that person necessarily, but they always talked to that person. And that person's role is a filter. And that person was often, not always, an American living in that country, if it was an American foundation. And I swear I could go many, many years to you and start giving you names of people. And say, everybody talks to her, everybody talks to him. The other thing that happens a lot are foundations recruiting other foundations. So some of this pass-through money doesn't just go to outside organizations. Sometimes one foundation gives another to do a project, right? That goes, and foundations will sometimes go out and try to recruit other foundations. You talked about those global funds. Those often started with a big foundation saying, we want to do this, and trying to round up all the other foundations to go along with it and create our own secretariat. And then another thing that foundations will do a lot is in part of the exploration thing, especially the ones that can afford it, let's create working groups.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of working groups. We all want to fund, you know, if we want to work on hunger in North Korea, let's get everyone together, let's do a meeting in Beijing and let's see how we're all going to do it. That doesn't mean we're all going to work together. But those working groups, and I'm guessing a lot of the minutes of those working group meetings would be very interesting for you.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And one of the things I can drill down, at least technically in the data, is co-investment, right? To what extent multiple foundations are making the first grant together to a new organization, right? And so that is something that I can tease apart.
So one thing which has come up a couple of times in questions and which you mentioned is really surprising and interesting is the single foundation, single organization pairings, the prevalence of those one-to-one pairings. And I was thinking about that and thinking that if I were a funder, maybe I would really like to be the only funder. And so part of that, because you have more of an opportunity to shape the organization, it sort of grows once you, so you end up having a benefit, but also maybe just control power, because if you're working with an overseas-based group, contract enforcement is going to be a little bit more difficult. And so I was wondering if one way that you might be able to use the data you have to tease out whether that sort of power effect is real is looking at the differences in contagion depending on how many existing funders there are already. So you might expect if funders have a big preference for being the only funder, that contagion would be quite unlikely going from 1 to 2. But once you got to 2, nobody has control over it anymore, so contagion becomes a real common thing. Or you might not find that, which would be sort of also interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. And I think the nice thing about the data is because I have the full population, like doing actually more sort of complicated network analysis paths I can do with it at some point. So trying to think about who's copying who and at what point in time they're copying them, I think is super interesting. So,
Carrie, we're out of time. Thank you so much.